Hi, friends, and welcome back. Thank you for people who've written in. And today's another response to some questions following the last episodes where we looked at faith and deconstruction in our lives through the ecological system theory. And as I intimated in the last one, I wanted to start to explore with you something called identity theory. And with a lot of these theories that have been created decades ago, we end up having some really wonderful iterations and versions of them come up. And so I want to look at something called social identity complexity today, and we're going to dive a little deeper into deconstruction as well. And this message is kind of directly in response to two questions and conversations I've had in the last 24 hours with some precious people who sort of said, I just don't know whether to call myself a Christian anymore. Like, I don't know whether I should use that label anymore. And I said, well, what do you say? And their answers were a little bit different. They're like, well, I'm just not sure, or it just depends. Depends on who's asking. Sometimes I say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. And what this tells me, and what we'll explore today, is that the answer to that question of do I call myself Christian or am I a Christian anymore is not as simple to answer as it used to be. Now, aside from simply saying, screw the whole lot, I don't believe in God anymore, I've converted to atheism or some other sort of belief system, I'm done, it's a heap of crap, F it all. Aside from that, which I think most people aren't at and don't get to, you're not going to be at that point in listening to this podcast. So I'm assuming that you have some questions here. What we do notice over time is that complexity comes. And so as we look at social identity complexity, I think we'll be able to unpack that a bit more. And I think it'll bless you. I think it'll help. It certainly has been another thing that has helped me with the ecological systems theory. Again, we begin to see that life is complex. You know, we have things that are very close to us, and they, as our life expands beyond us into other systems, exosystems, metasystems, etc., it all becomes very complex. You'll have to listen to the other episodes. But social identity theory, or SIC, or SIC theory, was developed by Marilyn Brewer, and she had some colleagues, and they did this in the early 2000s at Ohio State University. You can Google the term up and look into it, or chuck it into AI, and it'll give you some great information. So the core origin stems from their observance that traditional and social identity theory didn't really adequately capture how people manage multiple group memberships, right? And I'll explain what that is in a second. So while previous theories looked at identity somewhat separately, Brewer recognized that people's actual experience of multiple identities was more nuanced and interconnected. So there's a paper she wrote in 2002. It's called The Social Self, on being the same and different at the same time. And though Brewer had developed these things in the 90s, she brought it all together, and it's influenced by something called social identity theory, right, by Tafel and Turner. It's influenced by self-categorization theory, cognitive complexity theories, and research on different identities. It's quite revolutionary because it moved beyond just acknowledging multiple identities to examine how people cognitively represent and integrate those different group memberships. All right, so that's a bit of a heavy start there, but I'll give you an example here of what I mean, because it's important for us to realize that everybody carries multiple identities, right? You might even call these labels. And sometimes these identities, and we look at this in social identity theory, sometimes we identify with traits that we have. I'm a kind person, I'm a moral person, I'm a funny person, and we might call those personal identities or intrinsic, something that you might label yourself, yeah? But group identities is really about groups and cohorts that you belong to. So here's an example. This is a great example of a professional woman. So you have a woman, right? So she says, my gender is female. Professionally, she works as a software engineer, right? She's also a mother, right? That tells us what her family role is, all right? So we've got a female gender, software engineer professional, mother, family role. She's Chinese American, okay? And that's about her ethnicity and nationality. She's Buddhist. That's her religion and a religious group identity. She's a marathon runner, right? That's her hobby or her lifestyle. She's a Democrat, right? So that tells you what her political persuasion is. And she's a first-generation immigrant. That's her social status. So we've just explained that this woman who's a software engineer is also a mother, a Buddhist, Chinese American, likes marathon running, votes Democrat, and is first-generation immigrant. We've gone through some 8 different identities there, yeah? So the first 3 identities might become more or less salient or, close together. If these were 2 circles, they might overlap a lot, okay? So at work, her professional and her gender identity may be more prominent, right? She can't avoid being a woman, but in being a woman in a software engineering world, because there's not that many women work in that space, that kind of does become prominent. At home, she's a mother, and her cultural identity might take precedence, yeah? At her temple, if you're a Christian, it could be a church, your religious and cultural identities might be more active. So she's, as a Chinese American Buddhist, there's a high chance she goes to a Buddhist temple. And for her to be of Asian persuasion and Buddhist is a little more likely than, say, an Anglo-white guy turning up as a Buddhist. Not to say they can't, but you see how this begins to overlap. And then at a political rally, her political views and her immigrant identity might be more overlapped and salient as well. All right, so I'm just trying to expand for you how these complexities work, right? So these complexities come in, the complexity comes in how these things overlap, okay? So being a female engineer in a male-dominant field, there's an overlap there. She's balancing being in the American workplace culture with having Chinese family values, yeah? She's navigating political world views that might conflict with religious community, managing time between professional demands, and then marathon training as a mother. So somebody with social identity complexity, this complexity of this happens on a spectrum, right? There's high and low. So, and within this theory, this is how we talk about things being high or low. So if there's high complexity, life is going to look different to if there's low complexity. And as you might guess, as we develop and as life goes on and as events happen, life becomes more complex, right? And I'll tie this in for you soon on how this links up with what we've come to know as deconstruction, or how this affects one's faith. Yeah, because what I want for you really is for you to begin to see that if you are moving through what we might call today as deconstruction, right? There's a high chance that you're moving through and into more complexity in life, right? That you're actually coming to realize that life is not that simple, that things have become more complex for you, that perhaps different worlds and values and things are colliding, and the simplicity in which you used to practice your faith has now become something that's more complex. Yeah. So a person with high social identity complexity, they'd recognize that these identities don't completely overlap, right? They would also perhaps understand different groups might have conflicting values. So values in your professional workspace or in your sports and hobby workplace may clash with your religious or ethnic values. Yeah. As complexity rises, there's more tension between different group expectations. You might feel comfortable expressing different aspects of identity in various contexts. You understand that being one thing shouldn't necessarily automatically categorize you in another space. And I'll use, for example, you might say, well, I'm a Christian. Doesn't mean that I have, in America, it doesn't mean that I have to vote Republican. Yeah. So you begin to understand that being one thing doesn't automatically make you another. Whereas when the complexity is low, you think, I'm a Christian, therefore I have to do X, or I'm an American Chinese, therefore I have to do Y. Yeah. I'm a mother, therefore I have to be this or do that. So it changes quite a bit, right? That's high complexity, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Why don't I bring in deconstruction, perhaps from a perspective you haven't heard before, and I want to go back to the roots of this, of what deconstruction is, because deconstruction is a, like academically, is a philosophical approach, and it is meant to reshape the way that we understand meaning itself. Okay, so a guy by the name of Derrida, his deconstruction began to, like, this term of deconstruction and this philosophy began to emerge in the 1960s. And at its heart, deconstruction shows us that no concept stands alone, right? So we've got this idea of complexity again, that everything gets its meaning through its relationship with other concepts, like how we understand day because we know night, right? So Derrida introduced us to this term called difference, and it's this fascinating idea that meaning is always in motion, and meaning is always differing, and it's always deferring, right? It's never quite settling down. And he challenged those comfortable pairs that we rely on, like nature versus culture or good versus bad, and showing us that they're tangled up in each other in ways that we might not expect. So it's not about destroying meaning, but rather hear this. It's not about destroying meaning, but revealing its complexities and showing us how what's left is unsaid often shapes what is being said. So think of it just like you're pulling a loose thread on a sweater or a jumper, as we call it in Australia, and you tug and you start to see everything's connected in ways you haven't seen before. Yeah. So this is Derrida's idea, and it sort of rippled far beyond philosophy, starts influencing things in literature, around things that were defined and understood in politics and society, and of course, as might be the case for you, in your religion, in your faith. So what makes deconstruction so powerful is, in Derrida's terms, is it just gives us a tool to question what we take for granted. And that's what we're doing in deconstruction. Yeah. Well, at least I could say most people are doing this. Yeah. They look beyond the obvious. They find meaning in the margins. Yeah. So again, we have this whole idea of complexity. Yeah. Looking for hidden complexities. And if there was a way that I would define faith deconstruction, it's the revelation or the revealing, the emergence of complexity. And now you might be familiar with Brian McLaren's 4 stages of faith. I've talked about stages of faith in a critical journey before, but he uses simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony, I think, or humility is his last one. And he's actually, there's so many frameworks. If you've listened to me before or seen some of my material, I love the critical journey and the stages of faith there, but they're all quite similar because it's something that has happened as a social phenomena for many, many, many years, for millennia. This is how identities are formed, because again, if you say I'm a Christian, you are referring to, in many cases, a group identity, and that might take on a very strong religious connotation, or it might like a religious connotation from a group identity, or it might become and be spoken as something that's very personal to you and something that you're happy to define. So again, within the complexity of labels and within deconstruction and within identity, what we are doing when we proclaim we are something is proclaiming and talking about the attachment or the adoption of an identity, and that is going to be perhaps something for your own good, for your own benefit, or for the benefit of others. Yeah. So if I'm on the phone to somebody and I haven't met them before, and we are going to go meet somewhere, and I say, look out for the tall white guy with the curly hair. Yeah. Look out for the middle-aged white guy with black rimmed glasses and the curly hair. Right. And I've just used a whole lot of things there. Middle-aged, white guy, male, curly hair, something that describes who I am. So again, it all gets quite complex, but this is the thing that we want to begin to own from the very beginning. Yeah. If we're moving into the emergence of our faith being reshaped, I can guarantee you that you're moving into complexity. And quite often, this happens through some kind of crisis or emergence of something that has become complex. Perhaps your marital situation has become complex. Somebody I was speaking to the other day is tried for many, many years to help keep her marriage together. And it was complex, and it became more complex, and it was unsolvable. So now she finds herself as a single mother, and then asking really important questions like, well, where's God in all this? I thought he's supposed to keep Christian marriages together and to heal and to help me to deal with all these underlying conditions in myself and my partner. Now what about my kids, and what about dating again, and what does this look like for me socially, because I now have different social, so how do I identify? Can I still call myself a Christian? And if you want to answer that yourself, that's one thing, but if you want to guess how others might be comfortable defining you, that's a complete other thing, right? That's a complete other thing. But I'll try and unpack that a bit later on, and this might become 2 episodes, but let's just keep moving here. Let's just jump back into social identity, complexity here, and talk about the difference between high and low, just to sort of clear this up here. One of the aspects one of the parts of our lives that it begins to impact is our cognitive processing, the way that we think, yeah? So in high complexity, you end up having like multiple simultaneous identity awareness, right? By that I mean you're aware that right now I am all these things. In low complexity, you end up really trying to simplify it all and all the categories, right? You end up being very binary in your thinking, in your patterns, and you end up having a fixed identity. We have fixed identity hierarchies, right? That in all situations, the most important thing is in a hierarchy situation is that first and foremost, I'm a Christian, yeah? And then I'm a dad. And then I'm an Australian citizen. And you hear this hierarchy so that in every situation, even if it's not necessary or not even part of everyone else's equation, you might be part of a running club, and then it all of a sudden has to be running clubs for Jesus. I mean, why can't you just run? Like, why does it have to be I'm a Christian? We call this is like they call it a sort of a superordinate instead of a neutral or subordinate categorization or hierarchy of identity. But when the complexity is low, you start bringing in these hierarchies. When the complexity is high, you understand that categories are nuanced, and the recognition of context really depends on how important it might be, and we call that identity salience. I know I'm introducing some big words here, but I want you to think. I can give you a real easy example from my life. My weeks are spent between being an aged care chaplain, right, where I walk around as the chaplain on site to 120 aged care residents. I wear a cross around my neck. I have a badge that says David Chaplain. I run and help facilitate devotions and services. I might pray with people. We do last rites. We do all the things to provide spiritual care to people. And it's very hard for me to not have my Christianity very close to me. My Christian identity is salient and very close and interwoven into that professional role. Yeah? So I do that 2 days a week. And within the context, my identity as a Christian is close. Yeah, my colleague is a female, so the gender thing isn't really close. You know, that I don't play or go, I'm a Christian man who happens to be a chaplain, you know, as if those things are in that hierarchy. It's just that there's a salience and closeness here of something that's important in that role. The other 3 days a week, I'm at a university. Yeah, I'm doing my PhD in a business school. No theology. I am lecturing on work and entrepreneurship. I'm teaching small business planning. Yeah, I'm marking grades. I'm working in different departments administratively. I'm writing my thesis. In that context, me being a Christian is not really that salient. I don't have to announce to the class before I lecture them, hey, just want everybody to know I'm a Christian, or I don't have to slip in the first paragraph, you know, as a Christian I do this. But as soon as I announce, when they ask what else I might do, because students are curious, I say, well, you know, I work as a chaplain. Now they can start to draw their own conclusions there. That's up to them, right? But right there, I've already semi-announced that I've identified as a religious person. But if I didn't say that, it wouldn't be there because it's not salient or important or contextual in that role. However, if I was lecturing on what somebody might call kingdom business at a Christian university, then my identity, my religious identity, might come in closer again. So what happens sometimes as we go through deconstruction is the complexity increases or context changes. Like for some people, the only and most important moment that they might call themselves a Christian or identify as a Christian is in church or a small group or in a religious context. Yeah. So if you go home and you're a parent by yourself and you might go visit friends and family, they may or may not be Christian, but imagine they're not, and you work in just a retail job. It's not Koorong or some Christian bookstore. Then your religious identity can and will stay separate in those environments. Yeah. And so this brings us on to beyond this cognitive recognition, which has lots of practical implications. It brings us into the social navigation. So in high complexity identity, when we move there, everything becomes fluid. Yeah. And we move between contexts. You begin to switch codes. You begin to have to manage your relationships. That becomes complex, and there's no kind of way of avoiding that if your life turns that way. G'day. When we look at low complexity, there's often very rigid social boundaries. If I think about the younger version of myself, wherever I went, I had to and felt very obliged to announce in some way or identify some way as a Christian, even if it was unnecessary. I wasn't able to adapt to situations. Yeah. And my social script became was very simple. Yeah. So the way I talk about myself and life and other things was quite simplified. And if you think about this within deconstruction, we think about power dynamics, how that changes in deconstruction as well. Yeah. For example, how much power a pastor or a minister has over your life, or how much you begin to allow others to dictate whether or not you're a Christian or a believer. In deconstruction, you begin to ask the complexity, well, explain to me what that is. And why does a Christian have to follow these particular social codes or this set of behaviors? Yeah. And you might really begin to ask really important questions that are deeply forming of your faith. Yeah. Another aspect within social identity complexity is this idea of identity integration, right? And this is where in a high setting you recognize that your identity has contradictions. Yeah. You understand that there are different ways your identities intersect. Again, you think of that example I used of that lady at the start. Yeah, the woman who's Asian American, first generation immigrant, Democrat, working as a software engineer, enjoys running. Begin to see how complex all these things happen and where these things might intersect. But within a low complexity thing, you end up having a single dominant identity, right? And you resist conflicts. No, I can't do that because a Christian wouldn't do that, or I can't be a Christian and play pickleball or tennis or whatever because it's not a Christian club. That tends to be what happens. Or I can't listen and enjoy music unless it's played by Christians. Yeah, those kind of things can be are prevalent and more common in low complexity environments. Yeah. And again, in deconstruction, this is what we do. We begin to question and categorize things. All right, we're moving through kind of on the last category here in social identity complexity. The other aspect of it is the environmental influence. So what this talks about is that we end up having the more exposure we have to diversity and cross-cultural experiences and multiple group memberships, the more complexity we need to manage, and the more that we're exposed to, and the more complexity enters our lives. When people are boxed in and separate, they tend to create lives that are very much pulled away, controlled and boxed from exposure, right? They end up living in a very homogenous, which means same environment, a homogenous environment, and they end up having a single group focus. And this is what cults do, right? They control. This is what controlling parenting looks like. You know, it is very controlled. The exposure is very, very limited. I remember working I went over to Japan about 18 years ago with the church we were at the time, and it was really interesting. As you know, a guy had been a Christian for about 12 years, early 30s, meeting some young American Christians who were coming over and doing missions work. I'd ask them, like, have you heard of this band, or have you seen this movie? And these were homeschooled kids, beautiful, wonderful people, young people who just had not heard of or been exposed to some really common basic things, And I'm not saying, have you watched Nightmare on Elm Street, but have you heard of this band? Or have you ever listened to U2? Stuff that would play on the radio all the time. Or have you seen Home Alone? I don't know. It was just, there was this deep awareness immediately that this person's life had been rather cocooned and enveloped, and that's what happens. And that you can stay in low complexity for your entire life if you stay in those environments. That's what happens. So contextual meaning within deconstruction is what we begin to unpack there. Power structures. I just have to ask you again, is who are you giving authority to be able to label you as something? Who is stopping you from identifying as something? That's important for us. It's an important question. That's a thread you begin to pull as you deconstruct. Should I still call myself a Christian? And I know that the answer to that question might be very different for me to answer here in the secular regional areas of Queensland, Australia, compared to somebody that might be in a deep red state in the US, particularly if they have democratic views, for example, because those things can feel very, very connected. Maybe you're in Texas or something like that. Anyway, hoping this is helping. If this sounds complex, that's because it is. My idea here is to sort of just expose how complex even saying I'm a Christian is. Or am I still a Christian? How does then complexity grow? Well, in early development, if you grow up around diverse environments, if your family and educational influence is diverse, there's a chance your social identity will be complex. Yeah. If, as you grow in adolescence, you are sort of given to in your formation identity exploration, your peer influence, is going to depend on this. Depending on your peer influence, depending on your exploration, depending on the way that you experiment socially. You might be a goth for 2 years and, do something the next few years. You might be changing and shifting in the way in your teens. That's often social experimentation. If you experimented a lot, that might be a sign of complexity there. Things that might stop that might be things like peer pressure, limited opportunities, social constraints you might have. It really just depends on your peers and mentors in your life. And then as we move into adulthood, we evolve, right? So your professional experiences, your life transition, the way that you might or might not continue to learn. If you have a fixed mindset or limited networks, it makes complexity hard to build up. Yeah. If you don't have a workplace that's diverse or a family that's diverse or learning opportunities across cultural contexts, that makes complexity hard to build, particularly as an adult. So there's a loud car. But if you can do all those things, you end up with more complex understanding of life. Yeah. And I think that's just really, really valuable. I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot more I can go through, but this is quite a bit as it is. Let me just riff personally here, based on everything I've sort of just shared there around social identity complexity. When it comes to our faith, when it comes to my personal journey, what is complex for me is that I have worked in ministry. I have, and you should maybe hear this also from when you're a pastor or religious person gets up there who's got skin in the game, in that they're part of their job, their career, their vocation is to promote the Christian message. It's important for them that their religious identity is very close to what they share. Yeah, I gave the example before. Part of the week I'm a chaplain. I might be lecturing at university. I'm basically doing the same thing as teaching. But in one of those, my religious identity is really close to me. And in the other, it's not, because it's not needed, right? Now, it's still inherent in me. But my religious identity, in particular contexts, in those places, is a group identity. Yeah. And that is not the same as my personal faith. And a person who's standing at the front of a church or doing a podcast or whatever it is, and is promoting, endorsing, want to encourage you in your faith, in your spiritual journey, is also most often, whether they're aware of it or not, forming and informing to you what being a Christian, yeah, or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Hindu looks like. Yeah, because these things are often defined culturally as well, through rituals, language, and heroes, stories we tell. All these things build culture. All these things help build group identity and social identity. But that's an external label. Yeah. Personally, though, for me, one of the things that pulling the thread on this external social identity over the years, and you can read this in my poetry, etc., is the personal journey that I've had with God, right? And understanding how complex that has become, because what is external is complex as well. Yeah. So it's probably important for me to add something very quickly here. As we develop, and this is very overarching, into the persons we are, We often have our own personal identity. We're very egocentric for the first 10 years. That's why every child thinks the world revolves around them. It's part of our built-in survival mechanism. Feed me, protect me, clothe me, see me, don't lose me, don't abandon me. We then move into our teens and 20s, and our social identity is there. And the core question we ask in a social identity is, who's my tribe? In our personal egocentric days, it's who am I? Then in our social centric, we ask, who is my tribe? And then somewhere around 30, as things get more complex, oftentimes a lot of people are in sort of childbearing and child raising years, and there's just a shift even biologically in many people's lives. We begin to see that we are out to build our own tribe in many ways. In the Mishnah, it talks about our 30s being the decade of sort of leadership. Yeah. And so there's often this change in our 30s where we're out wanting to do our own things, and social things, we begin to see things differently. And that happens. And so this is why I think a lot of people begin to hit the 30s and 40s, and deconstruction comes in, because their lives become more complex, and some of the simplicity that has been around being able to really answer who is my tribe and who am I takes a direct turn. Yeah, because you begin to go, well, why are all these people getting this huge say in my life? Yeah. So we begin to want to navigate our own thing. So back to that, when you, this may not make no sense, but when you move beyond the external label of being a Christian, you begin to move inward and begin to ask those questions, not just of who am I, and have I accepted Jesus into my life, and have I followed the rules? For me, and this is not the same for everybody, I would definitely recognize that, but when I began to pull on those threads, particularly because my jobs and my careers have had to do often with Christian ministry, is I had to begin to explore my theology different. The questions of who am I and who is my tribe are still always there in the background, but I'm also asking, who's going to pay my bills? How's my family staying together? Who's running the country? What do I need to learn next? There's a lot of other questions begin to move on. How do I survive? How do I, hedge my bets for survival in this world? And so for me, what has drastically changed is that particularly in my 30s, I really began to pursue God for myself, aside from the container that I had spent the first 30 years in. I was away from the influence of my parents. I was away from the influence of a lot of my socials and peers as we all went and built our own lives. So you kind of left in the desert a little bit, saying, well, I have to answer these questions again of who am I and how's this all working? And this is really a great invitation into complexity, I think. It's a great invitation into a deeper walk with God. I have to wonder why in Hebrew culture, most people weren't affirmed in their rabbinic calling or other things until their 30s. You see this in Jesus' life, in the life of David, King David, and others. Joseph, I think, was very similar. A lot of things waited until they were in their 30s. Why? Well, I wonder if it has to do with this, that you really are out there on your own journey and defining your own thing and asking things for yourself. And so for me, in the context that I began to have these encounters with God that I really had to manage who I told, for two reasons. A, people would question whether they were real, and B, other Christians would get jealous. And that happens. I've seen it massively. Yeah. And that shaped who I was, right? And it would happen not just for me, but particularly when I was doing a lot of work around inner healing, I would be part of other people's encounters with God through Jesus or through the Father or through the Holy Spirit, through the Trinity. And it really began to undo the picture of Jesus I was handed to for well over a decade in church. And then I'm having to, through complexity, begin to make sense of all those things in my lives and in the lives of others, in the lives of the situations that we went through the difficult, challenging circumstances of life. And that's shaped who I am. And that's shaped who I was. And I can't help that. So for me, largely, if I was going to answer the question of would I call myself a Christian, and the answer would be, well, it depends who's asking, and it depends what they want to know. However, for me personally, having a connection to God, for me through Christ, is not just part of who I am, and catch this, it's beginning to understand that Jesus identifies with me. It's not about the way that I identify with him. So for many, many years, I would want to live a life that told God that I love you and I honor you. How many songs do we sing? How often do we say, God, I love you? We read in Scripture about the love of God. I think 1 John chapter 4 is a beautiful and challenging chapter, but mine has not moved to just, I love you, but I begin with, I love you too. So I don't know if you've got people in your life, might be family, might be friends, whereas if you say to them, I love you, they'll respond, I love you too. So in our house, in my relationship with Natalie, not that it's not meant, but it's often more genuine, but it is almost an automatic thing, is to say that I love you, and then to hear I love you too back. It's a call and a response. I'll tell my sons, my daughter, I love you, and they'll say, love you too. My daughter says, la you. That's a little joke we have. We even put in text, la you, and then la you too. I love you back. And for me, this is almost like it says in 1 John, I think it's 1 John chapter 4, that we love because he first loved us. So the only way that I have any capacity to love God or anyone is a response of the love of God that's in me, or anybody who has a capacity and can love has God in them. That's God. So my devotion has turned from I love you to I love you too. From I love you over to I love you too. What has that got to do with social identity deconstruction? Well, it has been the slow erosion of hierarchy and sort of this power and agency that I had really attached to my faith, in that I am the sole and controlling agent of this. For example, I'm going to let Jesus into my life. Instead of me understanding that I've been already invited, included in his, right? He already did the work. That salvation is not a work from me of things that I can do, even through me accepting Jesus into my heart. But salvation is the work of Christ. That God was in Christ, redeeming the whole world to himself. Yeah. And so not operating from a place of fear, including the fear of how others might punish me if I might call myself a Christian, because they hold me to the moral and group identity dynamics of that they adhere to. I can call myself loved by God with a great sense of ease, understanding that quite genuinely, it's not about I love you, God, would you come into my heart, and keeping that up. It's allowing the love of God to be shed abroad in my heart, and for me to respond with an embodied sense of I love you too. Yeah. It's about, for me, really understanding that even as I record this around Christmas, we're reminded that God actually enters humanity lives in it for some 30 years, is crucified, is wounded, right? Dies, is resurrected, and spends 40 days here with open wounds, disability, like the full human experience. And the resurrected form of Jesus wasn't perfect because you can't put your hand in there. I mean, some disability theology, we need a little bit more about that, and this whole idea of him being perfected in perfect form, because there's nothing wrong with him, is ridiculous. He had scars. I don't know if he had nails in his wrists or in his hands. Thomas was able to put his hand in his side. I mean, that form of Christ is ascended and is in the heavens. So humanity is in the Trinity. And my response in this life, for me as a Christian, is somebody who begins to, not that I'm not holding this against him, but for me as a Christian, what's important to me in the complexity of my faith at this point in time is for me to just responding to the work and love of God with I love you too. And that's where it's come to me that if somebody says, are you Christian? I can say yes. But if they ask further, I'd say, look, my faith is complex because my life is complex. I have to manage and live within a whole lot of identities, my personal identities, my group identities, all these things, right, are all in there. Anyway, talked for a long time. I'll try and unpack some more of this. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know this is a different way of approaching faith or deconstruction through theoretical lenses like this. Hope that it's valuable. Please keep sending your questions, comments, and feedback through. And maybe you want to try in your devotion, or just a simple prayer, is just to begin to practice the devotional prayer of I love you too. I love you too. Peace, love, take care.